Welcome to this Fireside Chat. The Fireside Chat by Pragati Leadership is a series of conversations between industry leaders and experts from Pragati. The objective of having these chats is to share deep and valuable insights related to leadership development. I'm Suhasini Kirloskar. I look after branding and marketing at Pragati Leadership. Today we'll be discussing how to strategically plan the leadership development of our people. And it's my honor to welcome our highly accomplished guest speaker, Mr. Krishna Raghavan, Chief People Officer at Flipkart and a winner of the Inspiring and Successful Leadership Award by Pragati Leadership. Krishna is a leader with a strong administrative strategy who believes that every employee's experience is determined by multiple factors, most influenced by their direct manager. And speaking with Krishna today is Dr. Niloufer Aga, who has over 25 years of experience in the field of education and corporate training. Niloufer is the co-author of a book, Manual for Creative Teachers. Over the past 15 years, she has been working as a facilitator and coach and has conducted over 750 programs as a facilitator, totaling more than 9,000 hours and almost 650 hours of executive coaching, and has served a number of industry segments. So with that, Niloufer, over to you.
Thank you, Suhasini. Hello, Krishna. Great to be speaking with you this evening. And I hope to take back some key takeaways and learn from your experience. So what I was thinking was that since we're talking about strategic development of our leaders, given the way business is moving, in different directions today, with all the volatility and in the VUCA world, what are some key skills that you think are vital for our leaders to develop?
First of all, it's great to be talking to you, Niloufer, and thank you so much, Suhasini, for making the introduction as well. It's a pleasure to be part of this series. And I think you ask a very important question, particularly in these times. If anything, Niloufer, I think over the last 2 years, the pandemic in particular has shown us that you can't really plan for anything. It is truly a volatile world. And as we exited the pandemic and we move forward, I think the fact that VUCA is now Bani, new terminologies can come, brittle, kind of non-linear kind of a world that we live in. It's very important for us to assess, therefore, what kind of leadership capabilities or competencies that we need to build in for the future. I think the first and foremost I would talk about is enterprise leadership. Particularly this is more pronounced at senior levels in leadership. And how do I think about enterprise leadership? It's about really, as a leader, connecting the dots. And it's easier said than done. Often leadership growth in companies is experienced very linearly, and people rise to prominence in their function. But increasingly in today's world, it's not about your function alone. You could be in engineering, you could be in finance. It's about your leadership to be able to take a view of the enterprise as a whole and see how you can bring to bear solutions that can actually solve the problem very holistically. And we've seen that time and again across companies. It's become a lot more interfunctional. There are a lot more dependencies that are required to be resolved for a problem to get solved. And so this enterprise mindset becomes very important as a leader. So that's one that I'd like to cite as an important angle. Second, I think very important is a lot of organizations are placed in the center of, I would say, transformational change. And, again, the example of, just digitization across various domains, be it in oil and gas, be it in banking, there are lots of things happening across the board which require you to embrace change but more importantly, as a leader, be able to actually champion that change. And because I think it's very easy to say, this is the transformation agenda that I want to drive. But your ability as a leader to spell out what does that transformation lead to, what does success look like, paint it very vividly for your stakeholders across the enterprise, and be able to champion that, I think is a vital skill for the future.
Right.
And finally, if anything, I'll just like to talk about third one. I don't want to speak about many things, is the ability to actually both be great at risk taking and innovate at the same time. These are two different things, according to me. Risk taking could be not necessarily innovative. It could be about taking bold bets in your particular domain, in your enterprise. And innovation, I think, is a must, right, in today's day and age, in terms of how to drive different, say, customer go-to-market strategies and things of that nature. So these are the three I would probably focus on for the leadership of the future.
So very, very interesting points that you brought about this whole thing of the enterprise leadership and the importance of that connecting the dots and doing solving problems holistically. I think that makes a lot of sense. And this being championing the change as well as the risk taking as well as being innovative. So in all these areas, how should one go about identifying these areas for each leader? What would be your approach?
Yeah, I think generally I would say it all starts with building the muscle around self-awareness, Niloufer. The journey doesn't even begin until you get a leader to recognize and acknowledge that these are important areas. And in every leader, there's obviously going to be a spectrum of capability. Somebody could be lower on the scale with regards to, let's take an example on enterprise thinking, but somebody could be higher on a scale but lacking in the ability to risk take. So you really have to get the leader to go into the space of acknowledging, and really what we think about it is, really, are you aware of yourself? Are you aware of your strengths? Are you aware of your development areas? And it starts there.
Right.
Once that's really identified, how do you make it real? Is, I think, some of the things that you have to do is to be able to get the leader to adopt and create the kind of development plan for themselves. Often in companies, it's about thrusting a development plan down somebody and saying, this is what I think you should be doing, versus it being actually crafted by the incumbent leader itself, right? And then there is obviously a lot of, I would say, buy-in, because it is owned by the leader, right? And then the journey begins. And I would say, finally, it's great and good to create a development plan for yourself, but it has to have some sort of a meaning in terms of business outcomes, right? And there has to be both, what is it going to deliver for myself? What is it going to deliver for the organization? Because often, again, just focusing on the input without the output arriving also becomes a futile exercise. And that's when the feedback loop for the leader itself becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop, because I am landing these inputs. This is the kind of change I am experiencing, my stakeholders are experiencing, and they're telling me so. And these are the business outcomes that I'm able to drive differently than I used to before. So I think that's the third element I would actually point out.
Very interesting. You made a very important point of getting the leader to acknowledge. So what has been your experience in that aspect? Especially at senior levels, how do you get them to acknowledge? And
no, it's a fantastic question. I think as you grow in leadership, as they say, it's very important to continue to learn and adopt a sort of a learning mindset, right? I think one of the things that I would lay emphasis on is call it out very clearly that building self-awareness is a key expectation of leadership in a company, be it any company, and uh, also evaluate leaders based on their ability to acknowledge, grasp new concepts, and build on their development plans, right? Uh, Rubber really hits the road when you start measuring leaders on the exact things you want them to move on. And that's what makes it real again for them. So that's something that we have really spent time on. I think in Flipkart as well, but we'll get to Flipkart later. But I think that's one of the areas that I would spend time on. How do I get leaders to acknowledge and move on their development path?
Right, right. Yeah. So once they acknowledge and they create their own plan, then strategically again, how do we go about building those skills in them? What is the right approach?
Yeah. So I think first of all, how do you define leadership in your company? That's the question you got to ask yourself, and that's also strategically, I would say, derived from what kind of leadership needs to be at your company in order to drive the overall company strategy. And every company is unique in its pursuit of what good looks like for them, right, or what success looks like for them. Mapping that to the leadership, I would say, competencies that need to be sort of communicated to all of leadership in your company and say this is what it looks like. I think that's the first step, because it starts with everyone having a shared view and a common view of what good leadership looks like in a particular company.
Right.
That's, I think, the first step, right? Second is, at every step in the leadership journey, there are certain critical junctures in that journey. For instance, the first time somebody becomes a manager, the first time somebody becomes a potential, depending on your company, whatever nomenclature you use, could be a director. And the first time somebody becomes a executive, which is at the vice president level or senior vice president level. These transitions need to be managed very carefully. For each transition, there are a set of new expectations that emerge based on the competency map that you've defined for your leadership.
Right.
How do you actually get them to, again, understand these new expectations, and what are some of the capabilities they need to build in order for them to succeed at the next level? Needs to be evident to them even before they get promoted to the next level.
Right.
So one of the things that you might companies should be investing in is in these transitions, in these leadership transitions. Third, I would definitely say, is making sure that you have all the support enablements available to them, which is more, I would say, like a menu of choices, because every leader has a certain style of learning.
Right.
And you should not cookie cutter every leader into one style of learning, that this is the only way the company is going to be adopting that learning. There could be access to on-demand coaching. There could be access to experiences within the company. I'm a big believer that there's only so much, I would say, theoretical learning can go. I mean, in fact, it's 70-20-10 in my opinion, typically. And therefore, making sure that you have access to experiences. So I think a bouquet of opportunities for learning is something that I would enable for leadership. And as much as possible, which is, I think, the gold standard in leadership development, is it's as bespoke as possible. Right? It's easier said than done in large scale organizations because of the scale challenges. Typically, you would push leaders into a cohort and say you belong to this cohort and this is the treatment I have for you. But ideally, I would personalize down to the last individual and make that very, very real, because when you connect personalization to the leader, it's a virtuous cycle of where the leader understands that this program is actually customized for me, and therefore there's a greater degree of investment in their learning. So those would be some of the ideas I would put on table, Niloufer.
Super, super. I like the last point specifically, which you mentioned about the personalization. I think that's a very, very valid point. And when people see that, the learning is being personalized, I think they will take greater interest as well, and the learning style as well, like you mentioned. So, in keeping with all of what you said, what are some of the best practices that you know of, from whatever you may have read, heard?
On leadership development in general, is that
Yeah,
what you're asking?
for best practices for all of this, how do you strategically develop leadership?
Yeah, I think I mentioned a few of them already, Niloufer, in an earlier conversation, right? I think first of all, there has to be access to best in class learning interventions, right, which are really curated to every individual, as well as maybe a cohort based or a particular function. And I think strategically, the unlocking the power of coaching in organizations, I think there again, making sure that the coaching that you're imparting really unlocks the individual. It's not again a very standardized methodology that's saying that this is the only way I will impart coaching. So making sure that people have access. I talked about a competency framework as well, right? And I talked about transitions. Um, I also think that figure out what your approach to learning in the organization is. I think we employed a 70-20-10 approach. But again, that's something that's worked for us, but organizations need to figure that out for themselves, right? And finally, all of this culminates into what I called a individualized development plan, which is created by the leader themselves. So I think strategically, these are the things I would definitely lay emphasis on. One thing which has to precurse all of this, by the way, which we talked about at the start, is the ability to look at a enterprise as a whole, look at their strategy, but also break down the strategy into the constituent functions. For instance, I'll just give you an example. Like, if you have focus on reaching the next 200 million consumers in middle India, and getting them access to commerce, that would spell out a set of capability needs at the enterprise level, but also at a functional level. And how is your leadership of today meeting those demands of tomorrow? So that also means you need to build leaders into better versions of themselves, right? So it's important to map out every role in the company to what is the future state of that role going to be. I'm a CHRO today, but I meet the needs of the company today. But as the company evolves, how am I meeting the needs of that role for tomorrow, right? And generally there is generally a gap. So it's not enough to assess the needs of today clearly. So build success profiles for each of your important roles and contrast the current incumbents to the future success profile, and see how you can build them into better versions of themselves in that role. And it's very, very I would say it's very important for the leader to understand this as well. And once they understand this, the why behind why you're putting them on this journey, the outcome is a better version of themselves, to put it simply, Niloufer.
Right.
So there's a much greater buy-in as well. So these are some of the things I would actually think about.
Right. So, given quite a wide spectrum, so now if we had to like zero down on, the good practices that you all have been following at Flipkart, I would love to hear some of those.
Yeah. No, I'll just build upon many of the things I already spoke about, Niloufer, and just point references to it. So we have a leadership competency framework called FK9, which is largely inspired by the agility framework. We basically look at every individual, irrespective of which function they are, whether they be in finance, engineering, or supply chain. If they're a director and above in Flipkart, they have the same competency spelled out. The nuances could be different based on the context of the role and the function that they perform, but it's a standard set of competencies. this has really helped us, give common language and also enable internal talent mobility, Niloufer. I think having a common language means you potentially can move across job families as well, because the expectation sets are really similar, right? And that's one which we have employed. It really is the way we hire, it's the way we evaluate, and it's the way we actually look at even things like succession planning, all of that. So from that perspective, it's very consistent. Number one. Number two, I talked about leadership transitions. So for every important key transition that happens in the company, we have a program called, for instance, Flip Up for our first time directors, right? Everything in Flipkart is prefixed with Flip. So you would have probably experienced that or seen that. And so that's a program that we have for our directors. And similarly, there are programs like Flip Ready, which basically gets them into, whenever they get into a leadership role, we actually employ that program. We also have used coaching on demand quite a bit. We moved away from the earlier avatar where we had certain aspects where we said this is the kind of coach that you need to get into a conversation with. But now it's like we have an empaneled set of coaches, and we actually employ them, and leaders can access into them as needed, right? I already talked about the 70-20-10 philosophy that we have towards learning, and we mandate IDP creation for all our leaders. So that is something that we do very seriously. And finally, I talked about our top level roles, which are very, very finite set of roles. We've evaluated what are their future success profiles looking like. And we've also got the leaders through an evaluation exercise or an assessment exercise to figure out how they stack up against the future success profile. And that's something that we are building them towards as well. So those are some of the strategies, practices we've employed in Flipkart against what we spoke about already, Niloufer.
Wow, wow. So I'm sure, like they say, when there is a sort of a roadmap for people, they feel more engaged as well. What has been your observation, having done all these things?
Yeah. I think it's a journey, Niloufer. I won't say that, it's you get it slam dunk the first time. Absolutely not. I think there have been multiple pivots we've made in the way we look at leadership development in the company. First is and foremost, which is a great point that you mentioned, is you need leaders to understand their, so to speak, why they are there at Flipkart. Like, what is their purpose? And is there a way to connect their personal purpose with the organizational purpose? And then truly magic can happen if you're able to establish that. And it's not easy to establish that, I would say, but it's something that I would highly recommend that organizations strive towards, right? We talked about self-awareness a lot. So that's something that takes a bit of unlocking. Leaders are at different points in time, different stages of acceptance. You will find leaders very resistant to take in the feedback as well. And you need to be very persistent and communicate with efficacy, with strong rationale on why they need to embrace this journey. But ultimately, I would say we moved away, Niloufer, from thrusting a program on leaders rather than saying this is what we think this is what we think will be appropriate for you. But you know what? Please opt in if you want to. And we've turned all our leadership programs to opt-in programs. So we've seen that not only does the opt-in increase, but there's also a greater buy-in to complete and make sure that they finish the journey that they've actually committed to. So that's something that we've done. You need to be able to make sure that all of the spaces that they're going through in their learning are actually quite independent of how they're assessed. It's a very, very important point. These are two different lenses. One is, what's your in-year performance? How did you do? And, a lot of your rewards are linked to that. But when you're on a development journey, it's critical, according to me, to de-link that with how you're assessed.
Hmm.
And to provide those independent spaces is very important, because then leaders get into a space where they feel safe to acknowledge, what their gaps are and how they're going to build upon it.
Hmm.
So I think at Flipkart, at least we've kept these two spaces very, very independent of one another.
Very nice.
And finally, I think their manager, right, having a very important role. And in highest levels of leadership, it may be the CEO themselves. Them being a very active sponsor of this journey is, according to me, very important as you move forward. So these are some of our learnings, Niloufer, as I reflect back on our successes and failures.
Very nice, Krishna. Thanks so much for sharing. Really interesting. I was particularly struck by this purpose that you brought about, and connecting people's purpose to the organization purpose. I would love to hear how it is done. Briefly, if you can share that, it would really interest me a lot.
Yeah. So I think we did an exercise where we got everyone to go back and through a series of interventions, Niloufer, to understand what is their origin story, right? And what got them here, to get into a reflective space, right? Each of us have a set of experiences through our life that shape us to who we are. I think understanding the individual behind the title, behind the role they play, is the starting point for us. And that happened. I think then getting them to unlock through a series of interventions what is their purpose, right? What drove them to join Flipkart, and why are they here? Often in our day-to-day activities, we don't reflect enough on this, right? And we got, and again, through varying degrees, I won't say, Niloufer, every leader embrace this with equal measure. Different people take to this differently, but I would say a good majority of them got to a point where they were able to define what drives them, what's their purpose in life, and how is that interconnected to Flipkart, right? And I'll give you an example. There was one leader who talked about growing up in a very lower middle class family, and did not have access to products, to consumer products. Not just because of only a lack of access to wealth, but also access because they were in a tier 3 city in India. And they had to resort to whatever was produced in that particular city, which is local selection of products. Now, this person's in life became, how can I provide this kind of access to products to the next 200 million consumers in India, so that they don't have to face what I faced in my childhood? And that becomes this person's driving force to join Flipkart, and that's the person's reason to continue with Flipkart. Now, if you're able to make such a connection, then whatever is needed to be done with the leadership journey finds tremendous resonance, because there is so much of buy-in to why I'm here and what am I seeking to achieve through the company, because Flipkart is in this space. I am willing to go the extra mile, forget extra mile, I'm willing to go extra 1,000 miles to invest in my development journey.
Yeah. And actually, stories of this kind are actually quite inspirational as well. No, when you hear people who are there with that purpose, I think it can be very, creating that climate of, you get inspired from each other as well. Wonderful.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. So, coming to a little more sort of an aspirational aspect, what are few things that you still aspire to do in developing your leaders much more than what you're already doing? I think you are doing a wonderful job. But anything that you have as a part of your plan?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that I would talk about. I think I spoke about it not in the Flipkart lens, but earlier, Niloufer, on the fact that ideally you should have bespoke journeys for every single leader. I think we are still on that path. We are not there yet in terms of creating that. We do have cohort based interventions now. So obviously at the highest levels of leadership, we do have bespoke development journeys, but not at, say, a director level, right? That's definitely something to unlock for us as an opportunity. Second is, I think as a HR community, as a function, we do a lot in terms of different programs that are catering to different cohorts, different individuals at different points in time in their career. And sometimes the interconnectedness gets lost, right? I'll give you an example. It could be around, you do a Hogan assessment at a point in time, right? You do a new leader assimilation at a point in time, say 6 months into the journey. These become point in time interventions, so to speak, but do they all talk to one another, right? Like when you think about a consumer website, when it personalizes products for you, for your viewing, it kind of collates all these insights together into one knowledge bank and accesses that knowledge bank and delivers insights to you. Could we have the same in the people function as well, right? Irrespective of how HR is organized or how you're imparting these interventions to the business, it all should flow back into the same knowledge bank, which is completely interconnected. It should not be a function of, which function in HR is doing it. Whether it be the function that's inclusion and diversity, or it's the function that's doing talent development. It shouldn't matter, right? So I think that's the path we are on, which is keeping the persona of the employee at the center and organizing the experiences that you're imparting to that employee in a very holistic and interconnected manner. So those are the two that, for me is like aspirational that I want to get to, Niloufer.
Wonderful, very nice. So, all of this that we spoke about takes a lot of time, lot of energy, lot of dedicated staff to get all this institutionalized. So, what would be, some good practices to, or a good approach to actually institutionalize it such that, it sort of carries on, whether, people come, people go, the process remains. And of course, a follow-up question would be then what are the challenges and how do we overcome that?
Yeah. It's sustainability or institutionalization is probably one of the most important things, or rather, I would say, legacies of a leader, right? Like, otherwise, it's very people dependent, like you said, Niloufer. What I think, we spoke about some of the things, which is how can you create very strong artifacts and very strong integration into the way you hire to retire of an employee. The examples I talked about, the FK9. Now there's a common language that every leader in Flipkart understands. It's not people dependent. So how can you create very strong institutionalized frameworks, which you then embed? It's not important to just create the framework, but embed it where it matters, where it truly matters. And I think human behavior is also shaped by, okay, what are both the positives and the pitfalls of me not following a particular institutionalized framework, right? And you need to make sure that that is very clear to every employee that's in the company. I think the more you do that, the better, adoption becomes overall, is what I would say, from a perspective of sustainability.
And what would be, the more you do of that, what would be some ways? Is it just reinforcing it in every meeting, or how do you go about it? What do you suggest?
Yeah, so I think first of all, embed it, right? Embed it into your talent processes, in the way you hire, in the way you evaluate, in the way you, evaluate successors for low roles of the future. How is your key talent framework also? If there's any framework for measuring top talent, how do you do all of that? I think making sure that it's embedded is the only thing I would say, Niloufer. Because communicating in meetings is one thing, which is about creating awareness, like you said, but we have to go beyond that. It has to be institutionalized into your talent processes. That's the only way it will stick, right? And making it real for every employee, right? What's in it for me?
Yeah,
That has to be very, very clear.
absolutely, absolutely. So, like I was saying earlier, coming to the challenge part, what could be the challenges to get all this done?
Yeah, it's absolutely I would say like the $1 million question in terms of challenges, because first of all, there are going to be multiple challenges along the way. First and foremost is, do people understand the why behind the leadership development framework, whatever you create within the company? Do they understand the thought process behind it, and what is the outcome that you're trying to drive through it? I think that's the first challenge. If that's not adequately communicated, many times many of the interventions fall short of reaching their intended outcome. That's one. Second is, it should not be something which is a side distraction. It should be very much integrated into what the role does today. I firmly believe that's why experiential learning is super important. The way you're able to impart this, if it is something like you have to do all of the things that you're doing, but take up this learning intervention on the side, I you will find challenges in terms of adoption. So it has to be very much integrated into the way your business works. It has to be seeped in business context. That is, I would say, something as a second area or challenge that we also faced and how we pivoted our programs. Uh, Third is, I think, just in terms of the manager sponsorship, uh, when you impart a learning intervention, a lot of the individuals in the intervention are going through shifts in their mind, and they bring back those shifts in terms of how they want to apply it at work. Now, if the manager is not clued in on what those shifts are going to be, he or she, the person going through the intervention, might find it difficult to even find opportunity to land the changes that they want to land in themselves. So it's very important to co-opt the manager on the journey that their direct or the employee might be going through. So I think that is the third angle, I would definitely say. And producing success stories, unless you show people what has happened with people following through, you'll find that many a times people see it as what is the ROI. That is the challenge that they may see. So making sure that you produce enough success stories across the organization, somewhere along the way. It may not happen immediately, but somewhere along the way is also important. So these are some of the challenges I at least anticipate, and some of the strategies we've employed, Niloufer, in Flipkart to be able to overcome them.
Really nice. This idea of producing success stories really very nice, because again it breeds much more of inspiration, and people feel that okay, if X could do it, definitely I can do it as well. And at the same time, the challenge remains of harvesting those stories and putting them in one place. So that is definitely a Herculean task actually. But if it can be done, I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Niloufer.
I mean, we've had some really interesting conversation. The last question I want to really ask you is, if you had to, give some advice to any other company who wants to sort of strategically plan and develop their leadership journey, what are a few things you would give them as like a call to action sort of thing?
Yeah. First, start with the why, which is, why is leadership development important for you? I think you should ask that question to yourself. It should not be a checkbox, that you're doing. So there has to be real business need for that. So making sure that the business strategy that you're embarking on is closely tied to how you're developing leadership of the future. So it really starts with the why. And that's a big call to action. Second is look at which leadership cohorts need the most amount of development, because it's not the same for everyone. You may not start on personalization right off the bat, because it's something which I think takes more evolution to get to. So making sure you identify what are the cohorts that need development, prioritize them. It's one thing to say that I'll do leadership development across the organization, but it's another thing to force yourself to prioritize. Because if you spread yourself too thin early on, you lose that kind of depth and focus that you need to produce the success stories that will emanate through the organization for others to actually take note of. So I think prioritization, so starts with why, go into prioritization. And I think from an execution standpoint, really make sure that you identify clearly what are those specific development areas that you need to target. Again, do not cast the net too wide, and make sure that you're very, very sharp on targeted development actions for your leadership. That enables also sharpness in execution. It also enables you to go deep into every area and also measure outcomes. It's very important to not just say that this is a leadership intervention that I've landed. It's also important to communicate to the organization, therefore, what is the shift that's happened. So we use a Kilpatrick model where we look at, what is the impact, pre and post. And that is something that I would lay a great emphasis on. So these are some of the areas I would say, Niloufer, like a clear call to action in terms of how organizations could proceed.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Krishna. What I really appreciated was, whatever you said was like straight from the heart with great transparency. So, I mean, that is something that was really very appealing and very heartwarming. Thank you
Thank
so
you. Thank
much
you so
for
much,
your
Niloufer.
time. Thank you so much for the input. And I think some very, very interesting points to take note of. And I'm sure, whoever's listening to this conversation would definitely take back some points to implement back in their organization as well.
Absolute privilege to hear a leader so forward-thinking and progressive as Krishna. So thank you very much. And thank you, Niloufer, for hosting this wonderful fireside.